Welcome to the Rant Live. Welcome everyone to the Rant Live after following a Bears win, which hasn't happened in 2 months.
First time in a while.
It's been a little while. I'm John Strong. That's Evan Altman, and we are here to, talk about what happened yesterday. I guess maybe we'll do that, and maybe some other things. What do you think?
Yeah, I feel like that probably makes sense.
Why not? How was your weekend? Let's talk about that.
I didn't really do anything. Which
that seems to be the COVID theme,
right? So it was like repeat the same thing from the last 9 months. But I mean, there's like nothing. Did I leave the house at all? I can't remember. I think I went out and ran some errands maybe, but I just kind of sat around, and there wasn't as much college football going on even on Saturday. So
yeah.
I kind of avoided a lot of that stuff. I caught up on some movies, I watched some TV shows,
Nice.
Just generally kind of sat around and did nothing, which was kind of nice.
Yeah. I don't know if I left the house either. It's always weird. And that has happened consecutive weekends where I'll go for 4 or 5 days where I don't leave the house.
Yeah. Well, and since I work from home, and what's nice is that I take, when we record these shows, this is essentially my lunch break, if you will. And so I don't have an occasion to leave. Even, I got my home office set up. And so, a while back when we finally, for a while I was kind of operating a makeshift home office because the room in our house that would be dedicated, that was mostly has a lot of my wife's craft stuff and so forth. And she's got a computer in there. Well, eventually I was like, okay, I'm going to be really working here. I got to set this up. So I got the dual monitors and I got a mount that has them on the desk. And so it keeps all that stuff off there. And then a dock that is just a universal one. So I can toggle between my work computer and my personal computer and have them both up on there. And so now I have a television in there. I got a 43-inch television. It's a really good sale. So now I really don't have to leave the room other than
all
to
day.
Go to the bathroom and eat. Yeah.
You don't have a fridge in there?
I was very, very close to buying one of those this weekend. I might still go that route because we were actually I was actually watching a movie up there because I had previously bought a nicer office chair, right? Because it's one thing to kind of buy the crappy, the $50, and you put it together and it's fine if you're only sitting there for, 15, 20 minutes at a time. But if you're going to be in the thing for 6 to 8 hours a day, you got to go, at least if you're more than, 15 years old, you got to get the cushy executive office chair, right? So because otherwise my back was a wreck after every day. So yeah, I could sit in there and just, I wouldn't even have to leave. I need to put a urinal in or something. And then I could really be
just the wall urinal, the actual real.
Yeah. Just maybe just drill a hole through the wall and put a tube there, Yeah. You get the waterless ones. I'm sure Sloan, official water efficiency partner of the Chicago Cubs. Obviously, the Bears podcast, but still, it's Chicago. They're around. They could probably work something out. But I figure, I could just get a PVC pipe or something and drill a hole to the outside, run it down. So I'm not just pissing all over the place. But
yeah, your wife might not be cool with that.
I don't think that it would. The efficiency probably wouldn't be real good to just drill a hole right through the wall. I guess I'd have to plug it somehow. But we're getting new windows too. So speaking of
that's kind of exciting. But it's one of those things. It's like getting new tires.
Yeah,
or a new roof.
Yeah, you don't want to do it, and we knew when we bought the house, some of the seals were kind of broke. There's a little bit of condensation inside there, and they don't work very well. And if you've had kind of the old cheap windows and they got the crappy little spring in them, and when you've got to be a bodybuilder to actually lift the window up.
Yeah.
Because it's
you've got to get leverage, right?
Right.
Everything's got to be open. You got to have clear.
Yeah. And then it's just hot as balls in the summer and it's really cold in the winter. So that was cool. But what's the interesting part, and again, I'll go a Cubs direction, but we're doing this first and I'm already telling the story. So we're working through this. And the guy was, I had left to take my son somewhere, but my wife was talking to him. So the guy that we worked with, the salesman there, is really good friends with a guy named Brendan King, who is a broadcaster for the South Bend Cubs. They went to college together. So I thought that was a fun little small world coincidence. And so anyway, So that was earlier in the week, and I am looking forward to that. And it's we got it on one of those deals, where we're like the home in the middle of the cul-de-sac, and there's nobody else that this company doesn't advertise. To do the thing where they come to your house, you get it super cheap, and you put the sign out in the yard and talk about them.
Okay.
And then you get a big discount, and then they'll go throughout the neighborhood, and then
all basically all the neighbors end up paying for your windows.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Which is kind of nice. And I was like, hell yeah, man, because we've priced it before. Windows are not cheap, so neither are tires. Jesus, I had to get my car fixed. Thankfully, they were roofs. No, roofs are definitely not. I could go on with fun stories about before we moved and getting the. Thankfully, we kind of got snuck in under a hail damage claim, and we're able to get a roof replaced on our old house.
There you go.
In order to sell it, which
Can't
was
get
nice.
those as much here in Arizona.
Yeah, that was kind of a harrowing experience though, because when you're trying to sell the home and the inspector's like, oh, there's this and this, and we got a claim on the furnace, so oh man, like home ownership, there are parts of it that are great and parts of it that really, really suck. So anyway, so I guess I had a more exciting overall weekend than otherwise I thought I had. So that's cool.
There you go. There we go. So good way to start off the show. If people who are listening or even watching are wondering, why aren't we talking about the Bears? It's because of the position the Bears have put us in. At least that's my perspective. Let me explain. So the Bears lost 6 games in a row. Basically 2 months they went without winning a game, and they looked really crappy doing it pretty much every single week. And even the wins, to be honest with you, looked pretty crappy. And then they go and put together their best, most complete game of the season after all of that, putting themselves in a position to perhaps make the playoffs. They have 20% odds to do that. And I don't even want to talk about that. But worse yet, to find themselves in the middle of the pack when it comes to picking first round draft pick, and more likely, a win like this, to me, what it does is it gives you a false sense of security. And when I say you, I mean Ryan Pace and George McCaskey, and lulls them into thinking that everything is going to be okay, and that the Bears are just fine. And, like I went over the stats for the game. I've got a whole sheet written here. They just dominated in every single way you can dominate a game. There's really, I don't think there's anything they did wrong. I don't know. What do you think? Did you see any holes yesterday whatsoever?
Well, so the thing is, I didn't watch the game, partially because, but I will.
Maybe it's you. Maybe
on.
You're bad luck. No more games for you.
That's probably it. I mean, I followed it right online, and was able to hear some of the call and whatnot. But my son and I were working out, so he's really into the baseball thing, and so we were doing some weight training and stuff like that. So we were doing that out in the garage, and I was following it. But the game was not on. So in the Indianapolis area, central Indiana in general, the only game we had was Vikings Buccaneers, which I had zero interest in. Right? I mean, outside of the ancillary of obviously people love Tom Brady or love to hate him either way. But yeah, it wasn't on, which is really odd. And then generally what they'll do though is the Bears won't be on in this market if the Colts are playing, right? Because you can't put somebody opposite, except the Colts played the 4:00 game. They were on CBS, and Fox still had a game once the Packers were on. So I was able to watch the Vikings and the Packers, but not the Bears.
Interesting.
Sad. So I was following it, but it felt like one of those though, as that's kind of the nice thing about Twitter too, is you can pull up in with any number of apps, right? And I'm still not a fan of like illegally streaming stuff, and I'm not about to pay $50 for a day of Red Zone and Sunday Ticket, because that's what it costs for like a day on DirecTV. You can buy it on demand, which I made the mistake of doing a couple of years ago. I was like, oh, sweet, I can get the rest of the season for no, dummy. It's that day you paid $60 for a day. It's like a pay-per-view fight. Anyway. But to see them here's my first thought. My first thought was, holy crap, David Montgomery, 80-yard run, right there, first play from scrimmage.
First play.
Awesome. Here we go. And I didn't tweet this because I thought in the midst of in the wake of such a big play, I did not want to resort to being my snarky self and be like, well, it's a damn good thing he got that big run first because he ain't getting many more. And he didn't. He only rushed it like 11 times. I'm
11
like,
attempts.
Why did they continue? Listen, it was great. And in the plan with Trubisky and watching the highlights and seeing all the stuff, it looked like they were utilizing him more like he should have been utilized starting 2 years ago. But why when you're up that big, why abandon the run game yet again? Like there's even when you're supposed to. So they abandon it when it's working. And the last game, they stopped running the second half against the Lions. It worked really well in the first half, then they stopped when it was working well. And in this one, you're up big. All you're trying to do is run the clock and get the thing over with early and, not put your – but they stopped. Like they just didn't run the ball anymore. And the pass was working, but you didn't need it to. You don't need to win by 29 points. This ain't college. You're not getting extra ranking points for beating up on an inferior opponent. I just that was the one thing that stood out to me as being odd. I'm not saying it was bad because they won and whatever, but I just that guy rips off an 80-yard run and he ends up with what do you have 113 yards, 108.
He had let's see, it's on my sheet somewhere. My sheet has so much stuff on it. He ended up with 152 total yards. He ran for 113.
Okay, 113. So it's still that's still solid, right? 33 more yards though after the one play, but on how many rushes? 11
rushes. So between him and Cordero Patterson, they had 17 rushes. This is a carryover from last week, though, too. I mean, David Montgomery was dominating last week. It's honestly, it's a carryover from the
whole season,
many weeks where, before the game last week, it's like Matt Nagy came out and said, we need to reestablish the run or whenever after the bye. And they come out and they ran the ball really well, but then they just didn't give Montgomery. Montgomery ends with 11 carries. And you're right. He busts off that 80-yard touchdown run where you're like, oh my God, they're just going to feed Montgomery the whole game. And I happen to have Montgomery, so I'm a little biased on my fantasy team. So I'm like, 200 yards. Last week, same thing. And he ends up with, he still did well. I mean, he was the second leading receiver on the team, believe it or not, 42 yards receiving, and the leading rusher with 113 yards. But I agree. I don't understand. I don't understand why they put Cordero Patterson in there so much. He got 6 carries. Montgomery got 11. Do I think Patterson is effective when he runs the ball? Somewhat, but I don't think they need him in there. I think they have a running back in David Montgomery, and they need to just work on giving him the ball and developing him. The guy is a stud. He's one of the top 5 running backs in the NFL, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and overall, I mean, he's good. He's good in pass protection. He blocks well. Obviously he's a good receiver out of the backfield. And I will put some of that on there because when you make a bunch of receptions, like we're not talking about a guy who's necessarily, he's not lining up wide and running downfield routes. A lot of those are essentially run plays that he's not actually getting the ball just handed to him. It's being passed to him, and whether it be little screens or little quick routes, things like that. And so and that even takes it back to when the Bears were really in their heyday under Lovie Smith, and you're looking at like Matt Forte, who would routinely lead the league or at least lead running backs in terms of receptions because they didn't necessarily have to run with him, but they would use him the passing game they would use as running attempts essentially, right? Yep. They're interchangeable. So I do want to look at that. But it felt like one of those, right, where for the first time in a long time, they actually capitalized on momentum. And you saw, whereas we talked about last week against the Lions, where Khalil Mack was completely shut out of any statistical impact on the game whatsoever. He recorded no tackles, no hurries, no nothing. And then here you had him right off the jump, right? We have a strip center. He got a fumble recovery. He got a safety. The Bears were in the backfield all day. And so that kind of goes both ways, right? Where both sides sort of felt like they fed off of one another for the first time in a long time, rather than being two entirely disparate units that, the defense was just getting hosed by the offense. But, and then also, as I mentioned this earlier, it appeared as though Trubisky was being utilized. Again, he is not a stand in the pocket, drop back, make a bunch of reads guy. He's get him moving, roll him out one way, and this is the same thing I thought the Bears failed with Jay Cutler back in the day too, because Cutler was so much better when he was able to roll and move and maybe make fewer reads, right? And you're kind of like, all right, let's trim this playbook down a little bit. Let's make sure it's not as complex. And that's not a knock. I guess it is backhanded compliment, but because he's a mobile, active, athletic quarterback, let him move and utilize that a little bit more. And it looked like they did that. Now here's the problem: is if we're talking about a team that had to take 6 losses to get there and already went away from Trubisky and then had to only go back to him because Nick Foles got hurt and was even more ineffective than Trubisky. Like, what does that say about your coaching staff that you could not get that figured out for this long? It took you literal years to really figure this out. And then it all comes together against a really, really bad team that honestly is even playing for even less than the Bears. You know, it kind of felt like one of those where, okay, whichever team gets behind early is just going to lay down and mail in the rest of the game. And that's what happened with the Texans. But yeah,
and their defense is awful. I mean, Houston's defense is one of the worst defenses in the league versus the Bears, who have a top 10 defense. And Mitch Trubisky, I love that he outplayed Deshaun Watson yesterday, because you have all the Chicago Bears fans that, grimace when, the Texans and Watson play the Bears, because it's like this constant reminder of, the 2017 draft, where we all know what happened, where Mitch got picked in advance of Watson and another guy that plays for the Chiefs. And so for him to actually come out and outplay Watson was a surprise for sure. But I mean, like, he thoroughly outplayed him. I mean, and that was a lot of the fact that the defense played so well. I mean, they had 6 sacks, which was the most sacks they've had since like 2011.
They had 7 sacks.
So did I. But when I looked on Pro Football,
did they change it? Did they read? Well, of course, and that's one of those things too. Though I guess you see that happen from time to time where they're like,
7. It is actually 7.
Okay, because I know sometimes they'll change it. That's a guy lost $1 million on DraftKings.
Yeah,
because they changed a sack into a tackle for loss.
Can you imagine?
But now I will say this, right? And so again, I don't want to take anything away from Trubisky, because Trubisky played a really good game. Of course, the Texans are without like all of their top targets. Like, their 2 receivers got popped. So you talk about a really poorly run organization, right? Like, that is, Bill O'Brien left that place in shambles. But I think there's more to it than that. But I mean, when you got 2 guys suspended for PEDs, your top 2 receivers, and I think there were some other issues going on there, but they felt like they were mailing it in. But so that's what was funny too, is because we're so used to the Bears quarterbacks running for their lives, behind a really crappy offensive line. It's like I said, the Bears and Mac were just in that backfield all day long, didn't give him any time. And yeah, but I mean, to see Trubisky do that, of course, what I don't want though is for this game to stand out and have everybody be like, see, we're perfectly fine. And they'll end up being like 8-8. It's like, we didn't have a losing season. That's another one,
No,
like,
that's what I'm saying.
Run it back. Yeah, I hate it. But
so anyway. It's just like one of those things where it's like, yeah, everything that you had said about the Matt Nagy obviously taking so long to figure out the Mitch Trubisky thing. Obviously the guy needs to have a target when he gets the ball in his hand, essentially. And he's got to be basically throwing within under 2 seconds to be successful. And he did that yesterday. And it's like, yeah, it's like, we all know this, install a game plan. And to the extent that Nagy's not calling the plays anymore and that Laser is calling the plays, which I believe he still is, maybe you put some of that on the fact that, you changed up who's calling the offense. So that probably plays into it as well. Maybe this is a better solution, but the fact that it took Nagy so long to get there. I mean, listen, at the end of the day, Matt Nagy, this is his first head coaching gig. He's learning, right? I mean, if the Bears fire him after this season, I'd feel pretty comfortable in saying that I think he's going to be able to come into the NFL and coach for a team and be a successful coach at some point. But it's hard to have a guy who's never coached as a head coach before in the NFL kind of learn on the job. And that's what Matt Nagy's doing. It's again, but that's the
I don't know that
part.
he's actually learning though. That's the problem. He's
But you
on the
can
job.
convince yourself he is.
Right.
You just saw like
that's what I don't
I was
want.
talking
I don't
myself
want the
into it.
Bears. I don't want them to be convinced that he's learning on the
I
job
know.
because it took so long. Because if anything, to me, this continues to prove his unworthiness for. I mean, unless you look at it and say, well, Bill Lazor is actually back to making these, and he's been in that role before. So it's not like we're talking about Lazor as some brand new, rookie OC. But if it took Nagy this long, and again, I brought this up, he lost play calling duties in Kansas City. Andy Reid wouldn't let him call plays anymore there. And he's like, oh, play calling's in my blood. Play calling is what I love to do. I'm like, well, then you're shitty at what you love to do, and you should stop.
You should stop loving to do that.
Or do better. But he had to give those duties up again. And if this is a sign that—
Did you just say duty?
Duty. That Lazor is more comfortable with it, that he's doing, because this is what we saw Sunday was easily the best. Now, could that be an aberration? Absolutely. Could it be a matter of the Texans just they mailed it in and gave up? Very possibly. But there's so much stuff that we see. And again, I go back to the Detroit game. I don't know. Did Nagy say after this one? They say, well, what did you guys do? Did he say, I don't know? Did he say they had to go look at the tape to wonder why they did well? Because that's what he says every time they don't do well. And if you are a coach that doesn't know where the failures are coming from, then how the hell are you going to know where the successes come from either? And unless you're just being dishonest, which again is probably actually closer to the truth that he's just being coy. But I'm just not entirely certain that he really is learning on the job, or that if it took him this long to get to this point, then I'm not, how much slower is that growth moving forward? Can you actually affect meaningful growth and change over the course of another 1, 2, 3 seasons? Because, and again, I don't think pace needs to be there. And you're not going to get a solid GM. You're not going to get the kind of person who comes in who's really, or generally, it's hard to lure them into that job if they don't get to change their coach. If they're coming in there and they don't get to make a decision on the head coach, you're probably not getting the right GM. So, to me, that's a package deal, and I think they both need to go, or they can both stay, and then it can just be mediocrity again.
It's like this whole I don't want to get into politics too much here, but it's like this whole, the Trump thing where he's sitting here saying, hey, the sky is red, everyone. See this sky behind me? That's red. And I'm just going to tell a whole bunch of people it's red, and there are going to be a whole bunch of people that believe me. It's kind of like what the Bears are doing. It's like the Bears are clearly not a good team. Their coaching staff is broken. Their GM is broken. But there's enough propaganda and confusion happening where you can be like, well, is it? I don't know. They played so well. Maybe Mitch Trubisky is the answer. Hey, they do have a good defense. What about their drafts last year? I mean, Jalen Johnson's really good. And who cares about Tashawn Gibson, and Robert Quinn?
Yeah. I mean, and that's what I'm afraid of. If they win a couple games here down the stretch, and again, they do well enough to finish at 500, or God forbid, make the playoffs, then you lean on that. And all of a sudden, but when you look back at like what didn't the Bears win 10 games and then Lovie Smith got fired afterwards? I mean, it's like they were
10-6.
But that was the problem, is that was, if you look at the Lovie Smith tenure, they experienced more success during his time as a head coach than they have in the other 30 years, essentially, since the Super Bowl. Or really even after that. So it's been more than 30 years. It's been, 36, 35. But if you go from like the early 90s, 90, 91, 92, you take those like 30 seasons, a lot of that success was concentrated, and then another Super Bowl appearance, under Smith. And then you take that and you look at everything else and you're like, oh my God. But the Bears, this is the Chicago Bears. Again, it's not the Texans, right? It's not the Jets, even though they played like the Jets or the Browns even, or Washington. And actually Washington is a flagship franchise too, or should have been. And you should expect more than that. They can't be looking at like, well, we had another season that wasn't a losing season, so let's go back at it again. That just scares me. But I think we have to put ourselves in ownership. Should they lie when they say they're upset about this? Because if that was true, then they would have made changes a long time ago. They do, oh, Virginia's really mad. No, she's not. She's like 150 years old. She doesn't know what's going on day to day. If they were truly upset about it, then they would do something to affect meaningful change. They aren't. and they haven't, and they won't, because it's operated as it's a family business, right? It's the mom and pop restaurant on the corner. And as long as they're not losing money, which, I think they have probably behind the scenes maybe managed to muck some things up otherwise, but they're cool. Like, what do they have? I mean, and this is without fans. What happens when fans start coming back and they start making more money, and they'll be fine? So I don't know. I'm afraid that that's what's going to happen, that they'll back themselves into playoff contention, a mid-level, or even not even in the top half of the league draft pick, and they'll see enough promise in the last few games, despite that bad losing streak and a lot of apparent ineptitude, to run it right back, and we'll be right back where we were, talking about the same damn stuff next year with less talent, because the cap drops by $25 million.
And they're not going to have Allen Robinson.
Yeah, and that's not going to be. I mean, they do, at least, and you had this piece in there, at least, and we saw a lot of this yesterday, right? The 3 young players who should have been getting a lot more run, no pun intended, early in the season, and finally the team is coming around. This is the other thing. Why are we having to write about this weeks before it seems like the team is ready to act on it? And that is Darnell Mooney and Cole Kmet and David Montgomery. Those 3 all played really well. And despite the fact that Graham got a touchdown, I mean, Kmet's been out snapping him like the last several weeks. I didn't look at the numbers from yesterday. Montgomery, as you mentioned, one of the best all-around backs in the league. Mooney is a dynamic receiver who can take the top off of defense when the quarterback can actually find him, which Foles could not. So there is promise in that. They do have a core of young, talented skill players, and that's something to look forward to. And those guys all, I mean, Mooney got a touchdown yesterday, and Kmet had 4 catches on, I think, 7 targets. So again, we're seeing him incorporated in there more. And then obviously we talked about Montgomery. So those guys, you've got something you can build on offensively.
And I think even you can throw Anthony Miller in there, although I know some people don't like to do that. But I do still think there's upside with Anthony Miller. He's still a young guy. Is this his 2nd or 3rd year in the league?
It's more than his 2nd. I'm trying to remember, but
then it's his 3rd. So,
but yeah, I mean, and those guys aren't making much money. So when you get young players who aren't making much money, when you do talk about a cap crunch, that's helpful in that you can make some changes elsewhere. Although then that stuff flips, because then when those guys have to start making money, if they continue to perform the way they are, then things kind of change around. But it does give you a little bit of flexibility. The problem is just that's the other thing they have to determine. Do they look at Mitch Trubisky from Sunday and say, this is who he is? But the problem is that you got to pay dearly for that kind of performance if you want to keep re-upping him. I mean, quarterbacks are really expensive as they continue to go along. Do you trust that? I don't, because I think things have to be worked out perfectly with the play calling and everything else to make him be able to do that consistently. But there again, they sort of backed themselves into a corner as far as that's concerned, unless you're going with Foles.
All very confusing, to say the least. There's really no, at this point, this win, after the win yesterday, which, as a fan, obviously you're sitting there, you're having a great time during the game. I mean, watching your team crush another team is always fun.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have a website and you have a podcast around the team, it becomes a little bit different with how you look at things. And really it becomes more about, with the win yesterday, they're still in the playoff hope. They still have hope for playoff. It's the Cardinals, the Vikings, the Seahawks, and the Buccaneers are the 4 teams that could be that the Bears could take their place, depending on how things play out. Very unlikely it's going to be Tampa. Very unlikely it's going to be Seattle. They both have to lose out. More likely that it's Cardinals and Vikings. If they beat the Vikings this week, the Vikings are looking real bad. The Cardinals need to lose 2 of 3 for the Bears to get in, and the Bears need to win 2 of 3. And so, I mean, a lot still can go out, but I mean, you think the Bears should beat the Vikings, could beat the Vikings. I mean, of course, we thought that. You don't know what's going to end up happening. So I guess we'll find out. Best case from my perspective is the Bears just lose the next 3 games and get a good draft pick and fire everybody, because if they don't, and if they get into the playoffs, or if they get real close to getting in the playoffs, we're just going to be in this, like you said. I mean, they're not going to fire Pace, they're not going to fire Nagy, and they may not, anyways, because the McCaskies don't like paying people that aren't working for them, and they have both of those guys are under contract, and if they fire them, they're going to have to pay both of them. I just don't think they're going to fire them. They can lose the next 3 games, and that's where my money is that Pace and Nagy are both back next season, no matter what happens. And that's depressing.
Yeah. And it's and then the problem becomes, what if they have another one? Like, what if they get a little bit better next year? What if they're 9-7, they're 10-6, but they don't look very good doing it. And then they lose again in the first round. They still don't have a good draft. Like we're not seeing a team. I don't see a really good path to them getting markedly better next year. Again, and I'm talking about outside stuff. I'm not, even if we look at, say they make a great draft and Nagy figures it out, Laser's calling good plays again, they do run it back. There's just not a great path when you talk about having to cut. And really, they're like, I think they're 10 million under now. So if the cap is 25 million lower, then it's like they got to cut 15 million or whatever the case may be. And, and that's tough because Allen Robinson's going to cost about that much, right? And you got to cut that much. And now you're going to have to pay him a little bit more than what he's making now in order to keep him. And I think that ship has kind of sailed, but now, it's going to be really hard to do. Although they might be looking at that in the same fashion as kind of what's going on the north side. Maybe they're going, well, it's going to be so tough to bring in a whole new leadership regime, given the circumstances we've got going into next year, that, hey, let's just run with what we've got here. At least these guys are familiar with it. They know what's up. And then if it doesn't work, then we're not paying, we don't have as much dead money. Then we get rid of them. And, the cap goes back up because we've had fans in 21. And then we can really go out and there's no way they're thinking this. I was going to say, then we can go out and get the real high, but they're not going to pay for a top end. They're not going to add a new, keep Ted. Now, there was a rumor that Phillips might retire, Ted Phillips, which would be ideal.
That would be, and that would be a start.
Then at least if they could replace him, that's the only way I would be even moderately satisfied with keeping almost everything else in place is if you take somebody who didn't come from Ernst & Young. I don't want an accountant. Give me a director of football operations. Because if Phillips stays, damn well they're not going out and paying a few extra million to hire a whole new person on top of all the people they've already got. They don't want to pay these people any money. And then they're probably sure hell not going out and getting a hot shot.
Like you were saying earlier, I mean, they're able to do this because there's sustainable income coming in. They're not going to be making decisions that's going to hurt that. I mean, they're fine with a bad team. You can live with a bad team if you're still making money. But it's you don't want to put yourself. You start making decisions.
But God forbid you have a really good team that makes more money.
I'm not sure they look at it that way.
If the Bears are actually good, how much more money are they going to make? I mean, I know you can I know it costs $100 to get nosebleeds at face value at Soldier Field, which they're not making money from this year. But you are getting, and I know obviously they don't get the full benefit of the resale market. But certainly that is playing a role, and people are buying more gear, and the ad rates are better for your games. Everything goes up. And I would guarantee that if they would just splurge a little bit, find a dude for $5 million a year to be your director of football operations or whatever, and add that into the fold and then have a director of business operations, your payroll might be a little bit higher. I will guarantee you that with more sustained success, not more sustained, any level of sustained success that they have not displayed in the last 35 years would actually net them a whole lot more money in overall revenue than what it's going to be. But again, that's what happens when you have somebody who's hey, they're minimizing their risk. They are limiting their overall financial obligation, and they're still making money as a result. So again, that's the formula. We all know it's true. That's what I expect to keep happening.
That's where we're stuck. We are stuck in the NFL purgatory. Bears purgatory.
Love it.
I'm going to come up with a name for that, like Bearscatory, something. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think that
That didn't really work.
yeah, maybe something ursine, but I don't really
Okay,
sure about that either.
look for a post with that in the title coming
It's
up.
always good when we can just completely shit on the future after a big win. Like nothing like Bears fans, baby. You got the first win in 2 months, and we still hate them. But
Well,
wonderful.
we hate the win. We hate what they've done to us, right?
Right.
I mean, it's like an alcoholic kind of like person who, like,
It's
is
the hair
just
of
a
the dog,
shit.
man. And we've been shitting on them for 6 weeks, and now they did something. It's like waking up with a hangover when they win. It's like, just let me get back to drinking my. I gotta drink the bitter tea here and then see what we can get. But
They did their one nice gesture over 2 months that's really redeeming if you let it be, and we refuse to let it be. So there. Take that. And I think that's a good way to close out the show. We'll see Vikings next week. We're going to see which Bears team shows up when they play the Vikings up in Minnesota. And we'll talk about that next Monday. But until then, see you later.
Bye.
Have a good one, everybody. Remember, be good to each other.
Something.